Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, and I'm PI's Campaigns Officer. Hi! We're going to, in a bit, give you like a spotter's guide to facial recognition. But before we got on to facial recognition, fairly recent news came out, I think the end of last week, that I just quickly wanted to talk about because it's huge. It's both huge and not surprising. The scale is astonishing, but it's not surprising. And it's the Facebook leak. So 553 million Facebook records have been either hacked or scraped, depending on who you listen to, if that's a useful distinction, which I'm not sure it is. It's like people's names, it's their phone numbers. So Mark Zuckerberg record was in this particular leak. Apparently he uses Signal, which is intriguing. I don't know if he uses WhatsApp or not, but he definitely apparently uses Signal. A ton of EU officials' personal phone numbers were included, because a couple of journalists rang them and were like, "Did you know?" And they were like, "Oh shit, this is a problem," and the EU is now having to review their security.
Somebody's got to do something about that.
Right? And Facebook didn't tell anyone. Apparently they knew about it a little while ago before the news broke, and they just kind of quietly didn't tell anyone, which means they might get in some really very serious trouble, because if you have this kind of data breach, whether it was hacked or scraped as a data breach, then you're supposed to tell someone within a fairly short period of time. You're supposed to find out, turn around, instantly inform people, and Facebook have not done that.
And I'm old school enough to be really annoyed still when I get phone calls on my mobile phone from fraudsters. And so tell me, Facebook has phone number data?
Oh yeah, and they got it in a really weird way. I'm pretty sure what happened was Facebook said, "Hey, can we have your phone number for two-factor? We definitely won't use it for anything else." And then, surprise, surprise, it did not stay for just two-factor.
Oh, that's right. So this is the idea that Facebook will tell you, look, in order to make your account more secure, so that we can detect anybody who's logging in using your account details who's not you, give us your telephone number so that we will, only for the purpose of securing your account, text you the fact that you're logging in, and possibly a code that you can enter. So it's a good security practice. And so I, not having a Facebook account anymore, but if I was a diligent Facebook user and cared about my security, I would do this because two-factor authentication is an incredibly important safeguard. And yet Facebook fucked it up.
Yes, they did not keep that data or that phone number kind of hived off for that one purpose. But yeah, so it's this absolute shit show. People's passwords, people's emails, people's phone numbers, and the scale is ridiculous. It's 553 million people. That's a lot of people. If you have a Facebook account, definitely at minimum change your password. Arguably, lots of people will tell you to leave Facebook. We're not going to do that just because, at this point, you've been told that a lot. If you're still on Facebook, you're probably going to be there. But if this is the last straw, by all means, leave Facebook. Yeah,
what is the last straw? How many times does a single company have to fuck up? And I think the most important thing now, unfortunately, is to change your goddamn telephone number, which is a gross inconvenience, which is why people are going to get even more of these spam calls. And it's not just spam that they want to sell you insurance. I think this week alone, I got 3 phone calls claiming to be from the tax agency in this country saying that I'm behind on my debts or there's a fraud investigation into me. And there are vaccine-related fraud initiatives. There's contact tracing fraud initiatives. And the whole point is that we shouldn't be vulnerable to these things because our data should be secure in a way that nobody should know my telephone number and any additional information about me. But no, shit like this makes it easier.
It actually gets worse because if I have your phone number, you become vulnerable to something called SIM swapping, which is basically I ring your telephone company and say, "Hey, I'm Gus. I've got a new phone. I just need to port my number over, blah, blah, blah." And I get access to not just your phone number, but your incoming kind of calls, text messages, whatever, including any you use for two-factor authentication.
And wasn't that how they got the Twitter hack last year? I think they even hacked Jack himself at Twitter by doing that SIM jacking.
Yeah, SIM jacking is easier than you'd hope. And phone numbers have become... We hand them out as if you just give them to all sorts of places for deliveries, for whatever, but actually it's pretty sensitive information. One option you have, is to give out Google Voice numbers instead, or to use kind of one-time phone numbers, essentially. Because it gets worse. Motherboard found a second cache of phone number from Facebook. They found like this weird service. You message someone with a Facebook profile, they give you the phone number, and that they claim extra phone numbers. They don't think of the same cache. So yeah, if you can change your phone number, it's probably a good plan, if only to stop you getting endless phone calls from people trying to scam you.
This is just such bullshit. These are trillion-dollar companies who should be doing a better job at all of these things. And there should be goddamn laws around this. Oh, there are laws around this.
But also, it sucks for us to have to sit here and say, hey, maybe you should change your password. If you reuse your password, please get a password manager and stop doing that, because things like this are going to keep happening. If there's a chance you can change your phone number, change your phone number. It sucks to have to sit here and tell you that, because we don't want to be in the position of saying, here are things you can do to protect yourself when things like this happen, because ultimately the fault is not yours, it's Facebook's. Facebook has screwed you, and they should be doing better, and they should be acting more responsibly, but they haven't. So whilst we as PI will always go after these kind of companies and try and stop them from doing this kind of nonsense and screwing you in these ways, it kind of sucks. The best advice we can give you at the moment, like for right now, change your password, get a password manager. If you can change your phone number, it's probably worthwhile doing, because at this point you probably are getting scam calls anyway. But yeah, so that's the fun times, good news, terrible news at the top. I don't think it gets better, to be honest, with the next section, but there we go. We are involved in this coalition called Reclaim Your Face, which is us and like 40 other organisations, including EDRI, Access Now, Amnesty, All Out. It's a ton of names you might recognise, supporting what's called a European Citizens Initiative, which is the European Commission's kind of petition tool, like petition function. But essentially what it means is, if we get 1 million signatures on this European Citizens Initiative asking the European Commission to ban biometric mass surveillance, which includes facial recognition, the European Commission has to respond. And they can respond in a variety of ways, but there is just a very strict process by which we get 1 million, and then we trigger all sorts of kind of policy responses that we may not be able to engage with otherwise. So yeah, partly this episode is going to be asking you, if you're a European citizen, to go and sign this European Citizens Initiative, which you can find at pvcy.org/ban biometrics, which will also be a link down below, and you can find it on PI's website, privacyinternational.org. So a spotter's guide to facial recognition is what I've called this, because it's kind of what I want it to be. So there are lots of different kinds of facial recognition, and a lot of them get confused with each other, and a lot of them kind of do different things and have different functions and purposes. And first is even just like when and how they're used, because there are two kind of main conditions of use for facial recognition, I guess you would say. One is live facial recognition, which it means like it's in the moment. It's happening as things happen, whether that's you walking past a camera and it's saying, hey, look, that's who this is, or that's, more likely that's who we think this is, or static facial recognition, which is facial recognition that kind of happens after the fact. So you take some maybe CCTV footage and you run the facial recognition over kind of a period of time on that footage. Like, it's footage you have, and later in time you're going to be coming back to. And that's static facial recognition. Most of the ones we're going to talk about kind of fall more into the live facial recognition category, just because they're the ones you're more likely to kind of spot, I guess, because you can't tell if a supermarket's going back later or a police force is going back later to footage and using facial recognition on it by sight. But in general, most of the types of facial recognition we'll be talking about, the problems are kind of similar if they're live or if they're static. It's not like the privacy concerns get magically better if someone's using it an hour later versus right now. But it's a distinction worth knowing about, I guess, was the first one. It's kind of a taxonomy one more than anything else.
But like this stuff matters, and coming up with a taxonomy of like, okay, what is facial recognition? How is it actually used? What are the different applications? And then what is it we don't like about it? That's this long journey that we're about to take you on. But this is how our brains think, because it would be easy to create a banner, and I'm probably insulting the very website you created for the campaign, that to have a simple message saying we should just ban something. By the way, the URL is pvcui.org/ban biometrics. But it's so much. It's easy just to say, stop doing something. It's easy to say, this be bad. It's harder what we have to do, which is like to look into the details and figure out where exactly is it bad and what can we do to stop that from happening. So, okay, I just took us down a long frickin' corridor, but I just love what you're about to do here. It's one of my favorite things when my colleagues do this, which is they try to understand something rather than just be outraged.
Well, that's the thing with live versus static, is sometimes people will say, well, our problems with live facial recognition. Live facial recognition is uniquely privacy invasive. It's uniquely problematic because, it's happening as you walk around in public space. There can be no kind of systems in place if it's just like an ongoing, like if it's a CCTV camera that's running live facial recognition, then there can be no process because it's just happening all the time.
It's like you put it at a train station. CCTV at a train station is like, okay, it's monitoring just to see if a crime occurs, and then it will be used after the fact. But if you have live recognition going on, it's identifying everybody in the train station at that moment in time, which is something that's never happened before.
It's even more complicated than that because the static facial recognition relies on the CCTV but isn't the CCTV. So we have our own problems with CCTV. But the live facial recognition, it's happening all the time. It's recognizing everyone in theory, that's the plan. Or it's looking for particular people and thus checking everyone. Static facial recognition does the same thing because it's, I guess, time slipped, because it's applied deliberately. There is some arguments that it is kind of differently invasive. The thing is, without safeguards, that's not true, right? Like, it's the same technology applied at a different period of time. If there are no safeguards, then it's not less privacy invasive.
So the example being, without the safeguards, it could just be at that train station, rather than have the computing power to do live recognition, at the end of every day, they go through the tapes and identify everybody who'd been there through the day. Versus, and I think where people think it could be less invasive is, on Tuesday at 2 p.m., something went really wrong at this train station. Let's use the one camera footage to identify everybody who was in that area, because we think something's gone wrong. And let's hope that something that's gone wrong is a clear crime and a clear investigation with all the safeguards has been started. Not just, somebody walked by that looked like they had a lot of money. Maybe we can advertise to that person. Let's identify that person for later onwards advertising.
But it's like, and then the level of safeguards becomes the question. Is it, go to a judge for a warrant and have to be a certain level of crime, a certain kind of magnitude, a certain urgency as well? And then the debate becomes the safeguards, which I think is a good debate to have. But it's worth noting that live versus static isn't inherently, there is no inherent kind of massive difference in the invasiveness. And the first kind of facial recognition we're going to discuss is like incredibly quote unquote basic. It's the kind of facial recognition that looks at you and says, that is a face. It's the kind you see on your camera, on your phone camera now, most of the time. It's the kind that draws the little box around a face and says, do you want to take a picture of this specifically? Is this your focal point? That is a face. It's almost the prerequisite for most forms of facial recognition, right? It's like just literally, this is a face. Sometimes you see it on supermarket CCTV. God knows at the supermarket that I go to most often, you walk through the door, there's a big screen with the CCTV of the entrance, and if you stand there, it sometimes will draw a little square around your face. This kind is a prerequisite for other kinds, and the fact that, like, it's recognizing your face doesn't necessarily mean it's doing more things, but it also doesn't mean it's not biased and it doesn't have problems.
Yeah, because I remember hearing of and I think this was in London, where there was a camera that would detect a face and only ascribe a gender and possibly an age, and then show you an advertisement right there and then telling you, isn't it really cool that we can create this ad? And yet they would argue, look, we're not invading anybody's privacy because we're not really trying to identify you. We're just identifying that there's a face and you look old and you look like a certain gender.
Well, this is a further kind of facial recognition. So once you've started recognizing faces, there's a kind of facial recognition, as with all kinds of these things, there are lots of different terms that are used. I would call these kind of categorization versions of facial recognition.
Sorry, I jumped you along your taxonomy. I apologize.
It's fine. Whilst I put a hierarchy, and we have like a little planning document, whilst I put a hierarchy, these are the two that could go either way. So with categorization, it's not necessarily trying to recognize who you are, but it is trying to ascribe certain categories to you. And we've seen people try and do that with gender. We've seen, which, like, as a side note, is horrific. If people are trying to ascribe gender to you, it suggests they know what gender looks like, and in all likelihood, they don't. That is incredibly difficult to do. It can make life quite difficult for trans people. And imagine if you're a trans person and you're walking down the street and suddenly a billboard is saying, "Hey, we recognize you're a man." It's like, you're wrong, and you have tried to do this weird recognition categorization on the basis of assumptions that were just wrong, and that's assuming that they recognize the face to begin with. Facial recognition algorithms, even just as basic as that is a face, haven't always been that good at recognizing, for example, black people's faces are faces. If you've ever tried to take a picture on your phone and the phone square has shown up over some people's faces but not all people's faces, then you'll be familiar with this problem. And some proctoring softwares have got in trouble for this, because they're not necessarily trying to recognize who you are, but they're trying to recognize there's a face in front of a camera sitting down to take an exam. And Proctorio recently got in a ton of trouble because they're terrible at recognizing that there's a black person actually just kind of sitting there. And kind of black students have been reporting they've had to find so many different forms of light to point at their own face just so that the software will recognize that they are there. There is a face, they are sitting there. But yeah, so categorization is like the next step. And so we've seen gender, we've seen people try and do age, and recently a group called IPVM have released a ton of standards on Chinese facial recognition that have been co-written with a couple of Chinese facial recognition and camera companies. And the categories that they're asking for are wild. It's like type of hairstyle, type of eyebrow shape, ethnicity, some of which are likely to be coming from other databases, and some of which the intention is you see a person and you kind of add these tags, like the categorizing based on this facial recognition. This is not a good kind of facial recognition. For one thing, it frequently doesn't work. For another, it's so weird and creepy, and it's just and so privacy invasive. It's not saying this is who you are, it's saying this is who we think you are based on what you look like. And that is not inherently better than this is who you definitely are according to your records.
The ambition to categorize is growing despite the failures. And there's also the emotion recognition that's increasingly being sold around. As we've discussed before, emotions are hard. Emotion recognition's bullshit. Even though that cops think they can do it, airport security guards think they can do it. They can't. It just doesn't work. But they're going to spend billions on it, which is why this industry is probably building it in too.
But what is the usefulness of gender recognition? That's my real question with all of these. Like, what is the use case? Because I can't think of any that aren't horrific. And then we move on to facial recognition that does try and recognize you. So the facial recognition so far has said, hey, there's a face, and then they've gone, hey, there's a face, and then tried to attach things to it. And yeah, these are the kind you'll see walking around. Digital billboards are a big one because sometimes they'll try and say, X number of people looked at me, X number of people of this gender, this age, was it a child, was it not a child, looked at me, and thus you did a good thing buying this digital billboard. You know, it's like click tracking functionally, but for eyeballs. So if you see a digital billboard, there's a chance that they're doing this.
It's not, I'm going to push back this a little bit. It's not like click tracking, because click tracking is for a website I intentionally went to in order to get something. That website might be doing something to me. A billboard is in my fucking space. You know, I'm walking around my goddamn city where I pay taxes, and they're just gathering shit on me and deciding to categorize me without any my volition. So
that is true.
Bite me.
If I go to Instagram and click on an ad, that is quite different to if I walk down the street and look at a billboard for a second and then keep walking. But okay, so face recognition that tries to recognize you. The most familiar, we'll start with the most basic, which isn't super basic, but it is the most common, I guess, which is facial recognition for authentication. So you might see this as one-to-one facial recognition. And this is the kind you use to open your iPhone if you have an iPhone. Or I think other phones have started to try and use this, but if you're unlocking your phone with your face is recognizing your face, comparing it to an image it already has of you, and then opening.
Your phone is recognizing your face. You said your face is recognizing your face.
I mean, I imagine your face is also recognizing your face in the image of your phone. But yes, this is a good point. Your phone recognizes your face. It compares it to an image it already has and says, yes, this is you, or yes, no, boo, this isn't you. This is also what you get at digital passport gates. If you slide your passport into the little slot thingy and look at the camera, it's saying, okay, I've got your passport. Is this person that person? So this is facial recognition for authentication. A lot of the time you'll be carrying around the thing that you're being authenticated against. Like, frequently it's not something that someone else has of you and is looking at. It's something you were carrying about and saying, this is me, you can double check, if that makes sense.
And you were involved in the creation of it. Mm-hmm. So it's you asserting it's you.
Yeah.
As much as anything else. It's not like the system created it on you without you even knowing.
Yeah. Again, the privacy concerns are there. There are some. And the security concerns are there. There are some. If you're unlocking your phone with your face. I know at least a couple of times in Hong Kong, Chinese police were taking your phone off you and shoving it in your face or in democracy activists' face to try and open it. There are privacy concerns, there are security concerns, but this is the kind of most common, I think, version of facial recognition trying to recognize you that people will interact with. And it's been around for quite a while, particularly digital passport gates. And I think it's a particularly useful example because sometimes like people talk about facial recognition and you're so used to seeing it in movies. You're so used to seeing it like elsewhere, and although it feels like it's coming closer, for a lot of people it still feels like science fiction, like people are being a bit kind of what's the word,
blasé.
Yeah, or like a bit hysterical, just like, yeah, okay, facial recognition's going to follow me around a city. It's like, you have already used and interacted with facial recognition if you have travelled internationally, and if you have tried to open your face with your phone with your face, god damn. If you've tried to open your phone with your face, you've interacted with facial recognition that's tried to recognise you. And that kind of helps us cross over nicely to one-to-many kind of facial recognition, which is comparing you to a list of people. So rather than you being compared to a single picture that you're probably carrying around, as you being compared to a list of people to double check. This is a lot more your traditional kind of facial recognition. So this is your watch list. This is the kind of, if you're one we've seen in use actually by police, which is they've got a watch list of specific people they're looking for. They're running facial recognition on everyone walking past a camera looking for those particular people.
Yeah, this is what was being tested in London about a year or two ago, where the cops pulled up with a van, set everything up on a street. I think it was in East London, and the anybody walking past would have their data captured. Sorry, their face captured and compared to a watch list. And so the police said, "Look, if you're not on the watch list, you have nothing to worry about." And yet, when some people would see the van down the street and say, "I'm not walking down this goddamn street. I don't want this to happen to me." And so they would turn down a different street, and the cops would be there waiting for them too, because avoiding the application of this technology is also a problem according to their eyes.
And this is the kind they've used at Notting Hill Carnival. This is the kind that South Wales police got stopped from using in the UK. The really interesting case as well, I think, in the UK was in King's Cross. So a facial recognition company called FaceWatch had been operating facial recognition on the King's Cross estate, which isn't the King's Cross train station, but it is kind of the area around the King's Cross train station.
And just for people who aren't Londoners, the area around King's Cross historically has been a high crime, high drug area. Now it's the exact opposite. It's a high Silicon Valley area where
Google just opened a campus there.
Google spent $1 billion opening their campus there. It's incredibly posh now. It feels like you're walking around Palo Alto. But even like Palo Alto is a bit of a dump compared to what this area has. It has every store you could ever want. It's not where regular people would be traipsing around accidentally.
It's the kind of area that you don't notice isn't public space until you're, say, homeless and you're being ushered off by security guards. If you are a Londoner and you're not sure what I'm talking about, it's the back of King's Cross, up towards Granary Square. So the police kind of almost under the table slid them a couple of images of people to add to a watch list. So it was a private company that was operating this surveillance, not a police force. And the police, with an interesting attitude to data protection, slid them a couple of images of some people they were looking out for. So not people who'd escaped from prison and needed to be caught because they were presenting a severe and present danger to the public right now in the next 10 minutes. Just some people, if you spot them, just nudge us or wink. So it's not just here is the police in a massive van. It can be quite insidious because anywhere there is facial recognition, these public-private partnerships between police forces and governments and private companies who should not and are not in the business of enforcing law get set up where police don't have to show up with their van because they're co-opting these private organizations to kind of circumvent the normal processes, which are already fairly dodgy. The Met's been trialling facial recognition for quite a while without any real authorization and for a while without wanting to tell anyone about it. So yeah, these kind of public-private partnerships, which have been popping up alongside facial recognition, are deeply concerning because they quite frequently have less accountability and less transparency than even the already concerning police use of facial recognition, which is deeply invasive and problematic. Because a while ago, Facebook actually started kind of doing this, where you upload a picture and Facebook goes, aha, I recognise that face, it's your friend Kathy. Do you want me to tag Kathy? And you were able to opt out of this facial recognition. The problem with that is, to opt out of this tagging system, they checked photos of your friend, your friends uploaded, when, oh, I do recognise that. That's Caitlin. Caitlin doesn't want to be involved in this, so I just won't tag her. But you've gone through the whole process. And it's the same with people walking past facial recognition. You don't opt out by not being on the list. You still get looked at. You still get facial recognition. And when the system doesn't work as it's supposed to, which is at the moment most facial recognition, and say you're black, there's a strong chance you're going to get pulled over for a quiet word by a police officer. Now, the Met have said that there is always a person in between the facial recognition and someone being pulled across. The facial recognition says, we think this is this person. The police officer looks at the person or the person walking past, and the image that facial recognition is returned and says, don't think so, or yeah, I think so, which isn't really adequate, because for all sorts of reasons. One thing, if someone's walking past and the police officer goes, oh shit, better grab them, how carefully do you think that they're sitting down and going, well, that person has a mole and that person doesn't? And it really requires you to trust that the police have the best good faith kind of version of this, that they're happy to challenge the computer, that they're happy to not pull aside black people.
Before you extend this capacity that they've never had in the history of policing and anywhere, unless even in police states, where they will now have the capacity to do it just about anywhere. That's the difference. It's one thing for a dodgy cop, even the best cop, to be in a corner in a specific neighborhood at one moment in time. But all of a sudden, because these public-private partnerships, they could be any street corner, public or private, and this process can be applying. And then when there's room for error, but leaving aside the error and the abuses of justice that occur consequent to errors, we have never had a situation where you could potentially face this scrutiny everywhere. You could potentially have this checkpoint at any moment in time. And considering the lack of transparency the police have had about their own deployment, let alone with the public-private partnerships in these small deployments, when it's everywhere, what the fuck? Yeah, sorry.
So it's really problematic when it works. It's really problematic when it doesn't work. And we shouldn't be designing safeguards on the basis of good cops. We should be designing safeguards on the basis of what is the worst version of this, because that's the version we don't want to happen. It's insane to say, oh, don't worry, trust us, when that frequently hasn't proved to be true, and we haven't been given the transparency and accountability to actually review what that looks like.
Yeah, wasn't at PI this week where we were sharing stories that we'd all read during the break, and one colleague shared a story from Belgium where there was a neighborhood where back in 2013, it's a neighborhood, a particularly Jewish neighborhood. Back in 2013, there were some attacks on the Jewish community, so the community agreed to put up cameras that the police could use to help protect the community. But now, under COVID, it's being used by the police and others, I guess, to monitor the community's adherence to COVID regulations. And it's like, you're entirely right. We always have to imagine the worst case scenario when it comes to the deployment of these technologies, because it not inevitably, but just in our monitoring of the track records, we don't see these technologies being used in less pervasive and invasive ways just by some natural state. The reality is that they tend to be used to their fullest extent in the most upside down ways.
Yeah, and so the last version of facial recognition I wanted to talk about is the kind that I don't think we've necessarily seen yet, but has been promised by companies like Clearview, which is not one to a specific list or one to a specific group, it's one to everyone, which is a facial recognition system in which so many pictures have been scraped, so many people have been entered, that I can point the initial promise, I think, of Clearview was a police officer could go up to someone, point their phone at them, and the Clearview app would return whoever it was. Not comparing it to a specific list of suspects, but comparing it to everyone's Facebook profile, and think every image that's been uploaded to the internet ever, whatever. So it could, in theory, recognize everyone. So rather than you're walking past a camera, it's looking at you, it's saying, is this a person on this list I've been given to try and look for? It's saying, oh, that's Caitlin. Caitlin keeps walking, and maybe it's not pinging something because I'm not who they're looking for, but rather than saying this is not X, it's saying this is who this is. And that is probably the scariest version of facial recognition, because it means that as you're walking around a space, whether it's, a police van or it's just cameras that exist and are up, whether it's private cameras, public cameras, it's recognizing me as I walk around my life and I do the things that I do, whether it's me going to a doctor's appointment, whether it's me buying, my shopping, whether it's me walking around the supermarket, picking stuff up and putting it down, picking up salad, going, actually, realistically, no, thank you, and picking up chocolate. This is the worst, most dystopic version, I think, of facial recognition. It's one that multiple companies have tried to explore, find ways of doing, find ways of getting close to. It's the one that scares the bejesus out of me. Now, all of them are concerning. Most of them are currently in use. This is the one, I think, that people are working towards, that probably doesn't necessarily exist right now, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes sense. This is what industry and authorities see as the holy grail. This is where it all ends up. This is what they're hoping for, and this is why companies like Clearview exist.
Mm-hmm. But you don't need this version of facial recognition to create a dystopic kind of version of reality. So if you look at China, if you look at Xinjiang, where China have been accused of perpetrating really horrific things against the Uyghur population, people have described the facial recognition and the cameras there as creating kind of like a digital prison. Because as you walk around, the cameras are going, or the cameras are attempting to say, hey, that person's Uyghur. Even if they're not returning a face, or a name, which to be honest, at this point in China, they might be, even if they're not doing that, even so much as the categorization, going back there, the categorization facial recognition can cause really quite significant problems. If you look at the kind of trans debates in the UK and increasingly the US, and what people refer to as bathroom bills, which is where people try and ban people from certain bathrooms on the basis of the gender they were assigned at birth. That's where you can really see these kind of cameras becoming incredibly problematic. So the categorization version of facial recognition is no less horrifying and can create no less horrifying outcomes than the one-to-everyone version of facial recognition. Each of these have their own particular flavor of horrific. Facial recognition, it comes in so many different flavors, I guess, and so many different people have done weird shit with it. Some researcher a while ago was like, hey, I wonder if we can recognize gay people based on what they look like. And it's and I think that his intention was, I think one of the gender recognition ones, the intention was to say, this is a bad plan. Here's how you do it and why it's bad, which is already insane. But the idea that you would create an algorithm that can tell if someone's gay based on their face, which already suggests significant problems in your thinking. The idea that the structure of someone's face is related to their gayness is bizarre and pretty homophobic. But the idea that you do that and you come away with something that you say works, and you think that there is any application of that isn't horrifying, that there is any version of that where you could install that anywhere, literally anywhere, and it wouldn't have terrible outcomes, is insane. It's just bizarre. You don't need the most dystopic version of this to create a dystopia.
Yeah, and I tend to take the, I don't know if you remember the movie Brazil. When we talk about dystopias, I take the Brazil approach.
I do not know that movie.
It came out at the same time as the 1984 version of 1984. And it imagined a dystopia, and it was totalitarian, but it was also incompetency is what gets you to become the target of the state. Literally a bug in the ointment results in the wrong person being targeted. And so my only concern about dystopic analyses is that it presumes a perfect operation of the system. and very clear intentionalities of the bad system, the bad people running the bad system in order to have bad outcomes. I take more of the view that bad outcomes are a result more often than not of any goddamn system. And you got to have the best of intentions as you deploy a system, and a bad outcome will be the result. And it's because technology doesn't work the way that you think it does. It isn't 1 and 0. It isn't good and bad. And the way that we integrate these systems into our lives doesn't work that way either. And so it will just lead to horrible negative outcomes where we have no accountability. And that's ultimately, this is why Facebook exists. This is why the police are excited around facial recognition, just trying to loop this all together. And it's because in our old pre-1980s world, in theory, if you were wealthy enough to be a consumer, you had rights. As you're interacting with a store, as you're interacting with the state, there were like customer support departments who would help you along the way, and there'd be legal rights that you have. This outsourcing to technology and this outsourcing to firms and this public-private partnership thing and the Facebookization of the internet has created like this, and this is what Amazon does so well as well. Like it creates this storefront kind of feel like, oh, I know who I'm interacting with because I'm engaging with Facebook, or I'm walking down this part of King's Cross. And then all of a sudden, if you ever have a problem, it becomes impossible for you to penetrate the problem. To seek redress becomes practically impossible because they'll say, oh, well, it's not us. I'm sorry, you have to go to this person. And then they'll say, well, it's the algorithm. It's not us. And the algorithm was designed over here. And the algorithm folks will say, well, actually, it's the source data. And the source data was from this company. And this company stole that source data from Facebook. And then it just becomes this whole fucking storm that you, as a sole individual, against not even this totalitarian machine, this machine of incompetency built on a house of cards, with that third pig that built a house with twigs at the base of it. That's the freaking world we're building. I'm sorry. You have such a very clear ambition for this podcast where you wanted to present this taxonomy. Instead, you had just me ranting in the middle, just taking us down these freaking corridors. But
that's the thing about, facial recognition, I've tried to be like, this is this, this is this, this is this. It's not really true. It's a bit kind of a fiction. A lot of these things wander into each other, start as one thing, end up a different thing, which is a significant problem. Like a function creep is just one thing starts and they say it's this version of this thing. And they go, oh, maybe we could add this thing. And oh, maybe it could be useful for this. But just the lack of transparency and accountability is a severe concern. And
the moment we say we want any of those things, so like, oh no, you can't just add an emotion recognition filter on top of your gender recognition filter, which was just added on to the is there a human present filter. The moment we start asking for these things, these companies and their idiots in government will say, oh, you're getting in the way of innovation, or how dare you stand on the sides of people who want to go to the bathroom, or how dare you stand on the sides of people who are on a watch list. God knows how you ended up on a watch list. Or how dare you stand on the side of people who might be having a bad day and the system recognizes them as being angry. Fuck.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So with the ECI, it's to ban biometric mass surveillance, and the mass surveillance is important. Like we're not coming for your iPhone. We're not coming for the convenience of being able to unlock your iPhone with your face. And there's a reason that we think that these technologies are so concerning, so problematic, so privacy invasive, that actually just kind of sitting down and saying, whilst there might be, some, I think we've said in PI before, like internally we've said, there may be some situations in which some uses of facial recognition may possibly be justified, but the safeguards that we would require for those situations for it to actually be used would be so high, so burdensome, so onerous as to functionally be a ban. That's kind of been the conversation internally. It's like, yes, there are some scenarios that it's humanly possible to imagine where it might be reasonable to deploy blah, blah, blah. But that would require such a long list of X, Y, and Z that it kind of almost invalidates that scenario. For one thing, like, we didn't even get onto how these models are trained. Like, we didn't even get onto how these models are being built and trained and where that data comes from and what is an acceptable source of that data.
But we can explore that in a future podcast, because
Yes.
we have some excellent colleagues at PI who are looking at this a little bit more and devising some interesting legal tools we can use to go after this. And so we can have them talk about that, and hopefully I will interrupt them less.
So exactly. So long story short, there are lots of different types of facial recognition. You might spot them out and about. Please sign our ECI. I mean, I think that's the thrust of this podcast. pvcy.org/ban biometrics, just in case you're wondering. Cool. So should we wrap up?
I think that's a good way to wrap up. We've talked about a lot, and you've managed to make facial recognition interesting again. This is fascinating, because I had to fight it back during when it was becoming a passport standard, and that was infuriating back then. And I think I lamented that in the last podcast, but you've managed to make this understandable, clear, and something that makes me want to sign a petition, which I hardly ever do. Actually, I shouldn't say that.
I mean, I think that, to be fair, like, just to go to the petition thing, the reason we've gone down this route is it's really specific. Like, if you open the form, you might see it's not a short form. The European Commission actually asks for quite a bit, depending on which country you're in. So if you're in Austria, the requirements are slightly different than if you're in Germany, because they're set country by country. And it asks for a lot. So we've been very careful and very specific about the data protection kind of involved, because it's a little bit... for one thing, we're never going to see what you put in that form. Like, to reassure you, when you fill that form out, and it does ask for a lot, it's not for PI reasons, it's for the European Commission mandate that amount of data, and they validate that to make sure that the people who've signed on are European citizens. We do not see or ever use that data. The reason we've gone down this route is because it does have such a, you hit this target, things happen, like, petitions can be really, really useful tools as a way of saying this many people care about this thing, and that can be great leverage. It can be great leverage for, MPs who have the kind of, are always, if they're good MPs, weighing the concerns of their constituents because they care about them. If they're dodgy, like slightly less, more venal MPs, it's because they have to get re-elected. They can be useful with companies because companies are trying to sell you a product, and if tons of people are saying, actually, we don't think this is acceptable, then they have to worry about their profit margins. So petitions can be extremely useful tools. And I get that there's some people, you feel this petition fatigue, where everyone's asking you for a signature, you sign stuff, you never hear back about it, and you feel kind of let down. Like, where did it go? What happened with it? What was the response? The European Commission have to respond. If we hit 1 million signatures, which is a huge target, and it is going to be really difficult, but if we do it, and I think we can, then we get a response. There's no kind of void afterwards. There is a thing that has to happen, and it's legally mandated. So if you sign this petition, it's not going to be like it's not something we did off the cuff. It's not something we thought, here's a problem I know, we'll do a petition. It's something we've thought really carefully about, and it's something that exists in law and has a legal and political reaction that has to then follow. So we're hopeful. But first we need to hit 1 million signatures, so please sign the ECI if you are a European citizen. If you're not a European citizen, don't worry, we are going to come fight facial recognition where you are as soon as we can, but you cannot sign this ECI. Anyway.
Excellent. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. And remember, we're running a survey to work out how we can improve this podcast. We want to know what you think, so please fill out the survey it's on our website, which we use a URL shortener to keep it simpler. So it's pvcy.org/TP survey. And you can find out more about PI and our work at our website, our regular website, privacyinternational.org. And as ever, we'll include some links to the relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening. And of course, you can like and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. It's also available on our website. The music is courtesy of Sepia.